There comes a moment in a parent's life when the world narrows to a single truth. You either rise for your child, or you disappear beneath the weight of your own fear. For Luke Morrison, that moment arrived quietly, without ceremony, wrapped in overdue bills and unanswered job applications. At 45, he had already buried his wife, watched cancer hollow out the love of his life, and sworn to himself that his daughter Penny would never feel unprotected. Yet here he was, jobless, drowning, staring at a future that had no room for mercy. The factory that had fed his family for decades shut its gates without apology. The apartment that held 15 years of memories echoed with the threat of eviction. Each night, Luke sat at the kitchen table long after Penny went to bed, listening to the radiator rattle like bones in winter, wondering how a man who worked honestly for half his life could end up with nothing to show for it. Penny tried to carry herself like an adult, but Luke saw the cost in her eyes, the dreams she quietly postponed, the college acceptance letter she never mentioned anymore. Pride kept him silent, but shame spoke loudly. He wasn't just losing a job. He was losing his identity as a provider, a protector, a father who could promise safety and mean it. And when the world strips a man of everything familiar, it leaves him with only one choice: surrender or build something entirely new with his bare hands. Greenfield had once been a town that rewarded loyalty. Men worked hard, paid their rent, raised their children, and believed tomorrow would look like today, steady and predictable. Luke believed that too, until predictability collapsed overnight. The eviction notice felt heavier than paper should, as if it carried the full judgment of every sacrifice he'd ever made. Penny didn't cry when she saw it. That hurt more than tears would have. She simply nodded, as if she'd been preparing herself for this moment longer than he had. Luke's friends offered sympathy, not solutions. The church offered groceries, not direction. The system offered forms, waiting lists, and polite rejection emails. At night, Luke drove aimlessly, gripping the steering wheel of his aging pickup like it was the last solid thing left in his life. That's when he remembered the land. 40 acres, Montana, wilderness nobody wanted, a forgotten inheritance from an uncle who lived and died quietly beyond society's margins. Back then, the land had seemed useless. Now it looked like an escape route drawn in faded ink. Penny didn't laugh when he told her. She leaned forward, eyes sharp, already imagining possibilities where he saw only risk. No utilities, no house, no money. Just trees, dirt, and silence. Luke saw failure waiting there. Penny saw ownership. "We're going to lose everything anyway," she said gently. "At least there we'll be standing on something that's ours." In that moment, Luke realized desperation doesn't always look like panic. Sometimes it looks like clarity, cold, terrifying, and honest. The drive west felt like shedding an old skin. Mile by mile, the landscape changed, and so did Luke's thoughts. The closer they got to Montana, the further Greenfield's shame faded in the rearview mirror. Penny talked about her mother, about things Luke hadn't remembered in years. The way Irene sang off-key, the way she believed strength was something you discovered when you ran out of excuses. When they reached the land, silence greeted them like a test. No road noise, no neighbors, just wind in the trees and the quiet judgment of untouched ground. The remnants of his uncle's collapsed cabin stood like a warning. This is what happens when nature wins. Luke felt small standing there, holding a toolbox pulled from the ruins, its worn handle shaped by hands long gone. His uncle had survived here once. That fact changed everything. Survival wasn't theoretical anymore. It was proven. That night they slept in the truck under a sky crowded with stars Luke had never seen before. The cold crept in, and fear followed close behind. He lay awake calculating costs he didn't have answers for, listening to Penny breathe beside him, reminding himself that fear had followed him everywhere else too, and done nothing but paralyze him. This place didn't promise comfort. It promised effort, and effort, Luke realized, was something he still had left. When morning came, frost clung to the ground, but so did resolve. They weren't visitors anymore. They were builders now, whether they felt ready or not. The work was brutal, humbling, and unforgiving. Clearing land stripped Luke down to the truth of his body and will. Blisters replaced doubt. Sweat replaced regret. Penny worked beside him without complaint, her determination sharpening his own. They learned by failing, posts set wrong, trenches dug too shallow, concrete washed away by sudden storms. Every mistake carried a lesson, and every lesson demanded humility. Luke had spent years believing expertise was something granted by titles and training. Out here, knowledge was earned through repetition and resilience. When money ran thin, strangers stepped in, not out of pity but belief. Penny documented their progress online, and Luke struggled with the idea of being seen. He had spent his life avoiding attention, equating pride with silence. Yet messages poured in from people who saw themselves in their struggle. When donations arrived, Luke felt conflicted, then grateful, then accountable. Accepting help didn't make him weak. It made him responsible to finish what he started. With salvaged lumber and borrowed wisdom, walls began to rise. The structure took shape slowly, like confidence returning after a long absence. Each board carried history, each nail felt deliberate. Luke wasn't just constructing shelter. He was rebuilding trust, in himself and people, in the idea that effort still mattered in a world that often rewarded shortcuts. At night, exhaustion replaced fear, and that alone felt like progress. When the developer arrived, the threat wasn't loud, it was polished. Money offered without sweat, solutions without scars. $400,000 could erase every hardship Luke had endured. It could buy comfort, silence doubt, and close this chapter neatly. But standing inside the frame of the house he built with his daughter, Luke understood something money could never touch. This structure held proof that he didn't quit. Proof that Penny would always know her father chose integrity over escape. The pressure mounted. Legal letters, inspectors, cameras. Attention turned their private struggle into a public symbol. Luke hated that part most. He never wanted to inspire anyone. He only wanted to protect his child. But inspiration, he learned, isn't chosen. It happens when ordinary people refuse to surrender. Penny handled the spotlight with calm wisdom beyond her years, reminding him that visibility carried responsibility. They finished the roof as summer pressed hard against the valley, working until their arms trembled and their voices went hoarse. When rain finally fell and stayed outside, Luke stood in the middle of the house and laughed, a sound he hadn't heard from himself in years. Shelter wasn't just physical anymore. It was emotional. It was earned. And no offer, no threat, no shortcut could replace that. As the house neared completion, Luke noticed the deeper transformation wasn't in the walls, it was in himself. The man who once waited for permission now acted with confidence. Problems no longer felt personal, they felt solvable. Penny's videos reached millions, and with them came opportunity Luke never asked for. Interviews, offers, attention. He declined most of it. He had learned that peace doesn't arrive with applause. It arrives with alignment. They redirected excess donations toward helping others, honoring the promise Luke made early on to pass forward what saved them. The land that once symbolized isolation became a meeting point for shared resilience. People visited, not to stare, but to learn, to believe again in effort and patience. Luke found pride not in praise, but in quiet mornings making coffee inside walls that held warmth. He framed Penny's room carefully, measuring twice, understanding that what you build for someone else carries a different weight. The house no longer felt temporary. It felt claimed. When winter hinted at its arrival, Luke stood on the porch and felt ready, not fearless, but prepared. That difference mattered. He hadn't conquered nature or life. He had simply learned to stand firm inside uncertainty. And sometimes, that is the greatest victory available to an ordinary man. The final weeks were about details, plumbing rooted carefully, insulation tucked tight, small imperfections accepted with grace. Luke no longer chased perfection. He chased durability. Penny planned her future again, not an escape, but expansion. College would come later, stronger for the patience it demanded. They talked more now, not about survival, but meaning. About how loss reshapes people and how effort redefines worth. Luke often thought of Irene during those quiet moments, imagining her approval not in words, but in the way Penny smiled, steady, unafraid. The house stood solid against early snow, smoke curling from its first fire like a declaration. Luke watched the flames dance and felt something settle inside him. He had built more than shelter. He had built evidence for his daughter, for himself,